Part 1. The Strategic Genius. Think you know what a teenage queen is capable of? Well, hold on to your crowns, because you're about to meet the most brilliant military strategist who ever sat on a throne, and she was just 18 when she started. The year is 1558. England is in chaos. The treasury is empty. The country is at war with France. And a young woman named Elizabeth has just inherited a mess that would make most modern CEOs quit on the spot. But here's where it gets interesting. While everyone expected this young queen to fail spectacularly, Elizabeth I was about to pull off the greatest political comeback in history. Picture this. You're surrounded by enemies. Your own family members are plotting to kill you, and half of Europe wants to invade your country. What do? If you're Elizabeth, you smile, wave, and proceed to outsmart literally everyone. Let me tell you about her first genius move. Instead of immediately picking a side in Europe's religious wars like everyone expected, Elizabeth did something unprecedented. She created a spy network that would make James Bond look like an amateur. Her spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, ran what was essentially the world's first MI6. We're talking about coded messages, double agents, and intelligence operations that were so ahead of their time, they're still studied by intelligence agencies today. But here's the part that will blow your mind. While everyone was busy trying to figure out if she would marry this prince or that king, Elizabeth was playing them all like a chess grandmaster. She'd entertain marriage proposals from every powerful ruler in Europe, keeping them all hoping, all competing for her hand, and all unwilling to attack England because they might still have a chance at the throne. The Spanish ambassador once complained that Elizabeth had 10,000 women's souls because of how skillfully she manipulated these situations. That's not an insult. That's what winning looks like. Remember that empty treasury I mentioned? By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England had become one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. How? Because this queen understood economics better than most modern-day financial advisors. She reformed the currency, streamlined government spending, and invested in what would become one of history's most profitable ventures, maritime exploration and trade. Speaking of which, let me tell you about the time she basically invented the concept of corporate raids. When Spain was getting rich off American silver, Elizabeth didn't just sit there feeling jealous. She authorized privateers like Sir Francis Drake to capture Spanish treasure ships. But here's the genius part. She would then invest her share of the plunder back into more naval expeditions. It was like a 16th century venture capital strategy. And when the Spanish finally got fed up and sent their invincible armada to invade England, Elizabeth rode out to Tilbury on horseback, wearing armor, and delivered a speech so powerful it's still quoted today. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she told her troops, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." That's not just good speech writing. That's understanding how to turn perceived weakness into strength. The Spanish Armada, by the way, was thoroughly defeated, thanks to Elizabeth's years of naval investment and preparation. But wait, it gets better. While all this drama was happening, Elizabeth was also engineering a cultural renaissance that would give us Shakespeare, Marlowe, and some of the greatest works of literature and history. She understood something that many modern leaders still don't get. Soft power is just as important as military might. By the time she was done, English culture had become so prestigious that even England's enemies wanted to copy it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sure, but she must have had great advisors doing all the real work, right? Wrong. Elizabeth personally read and responded to thousands of documents, often working late into the night. She spoke 6 languages fluently and could debate philosophy and politics in all of them. Part 2. The Warrior Queen. Now, if you thought Elizabeth I was impressive, wait until you meet the queen who made Vikings look tame. Let me introduce you to Boudica, and trust me, this story is going to make Game of Thrones look like a tea party. Picture this. It's 60 AD in ancient Britain. The Romans have just done something incredibly stupid. They've decided to mess with a Celtic queen. Big mistake. Huge. You see, when Boudica's husband, The king of the Iceni tribe died. He thought he'd made a smart political move. He named both the Roman emperor and his own daughters as co-heirs, thinking this would protect his family and his people. Spoiler alert, the Romans didn't get the memo about sharing. Instead of honoring the agreement, they decided to show up and take everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. They publicly flogged Boudica, assaulted her daughters, and turned their kingdom into a Roman piggy bank. Now, here's where most people would probably curl up and accept defeat. But Boudica, she chose violence. And not just any violence. We're talking about the kind of revenge that makes John Wick look like an amateur. She rallied not just her own tribe, but convinced other British tribes to join her cause. Imagine being so persuasive that you can get a bunch of people who normally fight each other to suddenly work together. That's leadership skills level 1000. What happened next is the ancient equivalent of a Hollywood blockbuster. Boudica led an army of 100,000 warriors. And yes, that number is historically verified. Their first target? The Roman city of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. The Romans, being Romans, were sitting in their city thinking, what's the worst that could happen? It's just a bunch of barbarians led by a woman. Those were probably their last thoughts before Boudica's army literally burned the city to the ground. And she was just getting started. Next up was Londinium, which you might know better as London. The Romans saw her coming this time, and most of them fled. Boudica's response? She burned that down too. Archaeologists have actually found a thick layer of burned debris from this period. They call it the Boudican Destruction Horizon. That's right. This woman literally left her mark in the geological record. But here's the really wild part. In just a few months, Boudica and her army destroyed 3 major Roman cities, killed around 70,000 Romans and pro-Roman Britons, and came terrifyingly close to driving Rome out of Britain entirely. The Romans were so shook that Emperor Nero seriously considered pulling out of Britain altogether. This is the same empire that conquered most of the known world, and they were about to tap out because of one extremely angry Celtic queen. Let me put this in perspective for you. The Roman Empire was the ancient equivalent of a modern superpower. Boudica taking on Rome would be like one state declaring war on the entire modern military-industrial complex, and actually winning. She didn't just lead from the back either. Historical sources describe her charging into battle in a chariot, spear in hand, her long red hair flowing behind her. She was like a real-life Valkyrie, except instead of collecting the dead, she was busy creating them. And can we talk about her battle speeches for a minute? Because they were fire, literally and figuratively. Here's what she reportedly told her army before one battle. It is not as a woman descended from noble ancestry, but as one of the people that I am avenging lost freedom, my scourged body, and the outraged chastity of my daughters. That's the ancient equivalent of saying, and I took that personally. The Romans eventually managed to defeat her, but only by bringing in massive reinforcements and choosing their battleground very carefully. Even then, it was a close thing. What happened to Boudica in the end? Well, rather than be captured, she took poison. Even in defeat, she refused to give the Romans the satisfaction of parading her through Rome as a prisoner. But here's the thing. While she might have lost the final battle, Boudica's rebellion actually changed how Rome treated its British subjects. After her uprising, the Romans realized that maybe, just maybe, brutally oppressing people wasn't the best administrative strategy. They implemented reforms, gave more autonomy to local rulers, and generally tried to avoid provoking any more British queens into raising armies against them. Smart move, Romans. Smart move. The Romans might have written the history books, but they couldn't hide their fear and respect for Boudica. They described her as possessed of greater intelligence than often belongs to women, which is basically ancient historians speak for, she terrified us but we're too proud to admit it. Today, if you visit London, you can find a massive bronze statue of Boudica and her daughters right next to Westminster Bridge. It's pretty ironic that the city she once burned to the ground now honors her as a national hero. Talk about a plot twist. Part 3. The Desert Rose. Now, let's travel to ancient Egypt, because I'm about to tell you about a queen who makes Cleopatra look like an amateur. Meet Hatshepsut, the woman who said, "Actually, I think I'll be pharaoh," and then just did it. Imagine being so iconic that when archaeologists discovered your tomb, they straight up refused to believe you were a woman. That's Hatshepsut's legacy. Here's the situation. It's around 1478 BC. Hatshepsut's husband, who was also her half-brother because, ancient Egypt, has just died, leaving their 2-year-old son as pharaoh. Hatshepsut was supposed to just be regent until the kid grew up. But she looked at that arrangement and said, nah. Instead of just being a placeholder, she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, pharaoh. Full stop. Now, you might be thinking, well, that must have caused a huge scandal. And you'd be right. Except Hatshepsut was playing 4D chess while everyone else was playing hopscotch. Rather than try to convince everyone she was just as good as a male pharaoh, she went ahead and became one. Literally. She started wearing the traditional false beard of the pharaohs, dressed in male clothing, and had herself depicted as a man in official artwork. But here's the genius part. She didn't try to hide that she was a woman. The inscriptions still use feminine pronouns. It was like she was saying, yes, I'm a woman. Yes, I'm pharaoh. No, these things are not mutually exclusive. Deal with it. And deal with it they did, because Hatshepsut turned out to be one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. While other pharaohs were obsessed with war and conquest, she was out here making Egypt rich through trade. She sent trading expeditions to lands that no Egyptian had visited in generations. The most famous was her expedition to the land of Punt, which was like the ancient Egyptian equivalent of finding El Dorado. This wasn't just a quick shopping trip either. She sent 5 ships full of trade goods down the Red Sea, which was incredibly dangerous at the time. The expedition brought back gold, ivory, exotic animals, and trees. Yes, trees. She had them planted at her mortuary temple, because apparently she was also history's first known landscaper. Speaking of her mortuary temple, let's talk about Djeser. This building was so magnificent that later pharaohs could only copy it, never surpass it. It's still standing today at Deir el-Bahari, and archaeologists are still finding new rooms and passages. But Hatshepsut wasn't just about grand buildings and trade expeditions. She was also a master of propaganda. She created a whole origin story about how the god Ammonius had chosen her to be pharaoh, complete with reliefs showing the god as her actual father. This wasn't just ancient fake news. It was brilliant politics. By claiming divine parentage, she made any opposition to her rule equivalent to opposing the gods themselves. Checkmate, ancient Egyptian nobles. For 22 years, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt in a period of peace and prosperity. She built monuments, restored temples, and maintained the empire's borders without constant warfare. Egypt had never been richer or more stable. But here's where the story gets wild. After her death, someone tried to erase her from history. They chiseled her name and image off monuments, destroyed her statues, and tried to remove all traces of her reign. For centuries, historians thought this was done immediately after her death by her stepson, seeking revenge. But recent archaeological evidence suggests it happened much later, possibly as an attempt by later pharaohs to maintain their idea of how succession should work. The irony? This attempt to erase her actually helped preserve many of her monuments. The chiseled-out images and texts were often just covered up rather than completely destroyed, protecting them from weathering. Even better, the ancient Egyptians believed that if you destroyed someone's name and image, you erased their soul from the afterlife. Well, guess what? We're still talking about Hatshepsut today, while the name of whoever tried to erase her is lost to history. The ultimate proof of Hatshepsut's success isn't in the monuments she built or the wealth she accumulated. It's in what didn't happen during her reign. No civil wars, no major conflicts, no economic disasters. In ancient Egypt, boring was good, and Hatshepsut's reign was gloriously boring. She proved that a woman could rule just as effectively as any man, more effectively, in fact, than many of the male pharaohs who came before and after her. And she did it without having to wage constant wars to prove herself. Think about that. In a time when most rulers thought the only way to prove their worth was through military conquest, Hatshepsut created a legacy through peace, trade, and architecture. She was basically running an ancient Egyptian renaissance, while other pharaohs were still playing war games. Part 4. The Shadow Emperor. Now, let me introduce you to the most powerful woman in Chinese history who technically never held any official title. Meet Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as an emperor in her own right. And when I say she ruled, I mean she absolutely dominated 7th century Chinese politics with a level of skill that would make Machiavelli take notes. Let's set the scene. Wu enters the imperial court at age 14 as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong. Now, normally, when an emperor died, his concubines were sent to a Buddhist monastery to live out their days in peaceful meditation. Wu said thanks, but no thanks to that plan. Instead, she caught the eye of the new Emperor Gaozong, who, by the way, was technically her stepson. If you're thinking this sounds like a plot from a historical drama, buckle up because it gets better. Gaozong was already married to Empress Wang, who, along with his favorite concubine Xiao, tried to get rid of Wu. Big mistake. Wu turned the tables so completely that she not only got them both executed, but she convinced everyone they had killed her infant daughter, when historical evidence suggests Wu might have done the deed herself to frame them. That's right. She was playing political chess while everyone else was playing checkers. But here's where Wu's story gets really interesting. Emperor Gaozong started suffering from severe migraines and possibly strokes. Instead of watching from the sidelines, Wu stepped in to help with state affairs. And by help, I mean she basically started running the entire empire. She was so good at it that when Gaozong died, she continued ruling through her sons. First one son, then another, until finally she said, you know what? I'm just going to call myself emperor, not empress emperor. Now, in ancient China, this was about as traditional as putting pineapple on pizza. The whole system was based on the idea that only men could rule. Wu's response: she created her own dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, and commissioned scholars to write biographies of famous women to prove female rule was totally normal and cool. She even had the nerve to claim she was the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. That's like declaring yourself the chosen one and actually having people believe you. But here's the thing, Wu wasn't just about power plays and political manipulation. She was actually really good at running an empire. She created a merit-based bureaucracy instead of just giving jobs to nobles. She lowered taxes for farmers, expanded the empire's territories, and supported education and the arts. She even invented a new form of Chinese characters, some of which are still in use today. She also established diplomatic relations with Korea, improved the military, and made Buddhism more prominent in Chinese culture. Basically, she was running a medieval renaissance, while other rulers were still trying to figure out which end of the sword to hold. And can we talk about her intelligence network? Wu created a system where anyone could report corruption or suggest improvements by dropping anonymous letters in a special box near the palace. It was like an ancient Chinese version of a suggestion box, except instead of ignoring the suggestions like modern companies do, Wu actually read and acted on them. She also had a network of spies so effective that she knew about plots against her before the plotters had finished planning them. She was like a one-woman CIA in imperial robes. Now, traditional historians paint Wu as a monster, cruel, manipulative, and power-hungry. But let's be real. Male rulers did way worse things and got called the Great. Wu was playing a game by the rules that existed, and she was playing to win. Consider this. During her reign, China expanded its territories, experienced economic growth, and saw advancements in education, culture, and diplomacy. The Tang dynasty, which she helped shape, is considered China's golden age. She ruled until she was 81 years old, when she finally stepped down due to illness. Even then, she negotiated the terms of her retirement. This woman was negotiating power moves from her sickbed. After her death, subsequent rulers tried to erase her legacy, just like they did with Hatshepsut. They destroyed her monuments and tried to write her out of history. But here's the thing. They couldn't erase the prosperity and innovation she brought to China. The bureaucratic system she created lasted for centuries. The diplomatic relations she established shaped East Asian politics for generations. The cultural flowering she encouraged produced some of China's greatest poetry and art. Today, historians are finally starting to recognize that Wu Zetian wasn't just a power-hungry usurper. She was one of China's most capable rulers, period. She proved that the gender of a ruler matters far less than their ability to actually, rule. And perhaps most impressively, she did all this while dealing with constant criticism and opposition, just because she was a woman. It's like she had to do everything male emperors did, but backwards and in high heels. To quote Ginger Rogers,